The worst part wasn't the noise, or the heat, or the unbearable weight of the thing hovering 60 feet above his combine shed. The worst part was the absolute crushing silence that preceded it. Elias Thorne knew his farm, knew the rhythms of the late Kansas autumn wind sweeping across the winter wheat stubble. Even on the quietest nights there was always something, the distant steady drone of the I-70 12 miles east, the rustle of dry corn stalks rubbing together like old bones, or the sharp territorial yelp of coyotes hunting field mice near the creek bed. But on November 14th, 1979, around 2:30 a.m., as Elias stood leaning against the fender of his ancient pickup, waiting for the kerosene transfer pump to finish filling the tractor tank, the world died. The silence wasn't empty. It was pressurized. It felt like standing underwater, your ears straining against a void that shouldn't exist. He'd stepped outside the pool of his headlamps and looked up. The sky was a vast, cold canvas of stars, millions of them, but something was blotting out a significant patch directly overhead. It wasn't a cloud. The air was too crisp and the stars too sharp elsewhere for atmospheric moisture. This was a physical obstruction, dark as polished obsidian, moving with a geometric deliberation that mocked the natural flow of the night sky. He instinctively grabbed the heavy steel pipe wrench he kept tucked behind the seat, his knuckles white against the cold metal, a useless defense against something that hadn't even registered its presence yet, save for this terrifying absence of sound. His eyes tracked the darkness. It was massive, far larger than any single engine plane he'd ever seen, and it didn't reflect any light whatsoever. It drank the starlight, leaving a perfect round hole in the tapestry of the cosmos. Elias felt the hair prickle on the back of his neck, a primal caveman instinct screaming at him to flee, to dive under the truck, to hide. But the sheer incomprehensibility of the object rooted him to the spot. It wasn't just flying. It was observing. It had stopped the moment he looked up, seeming to hang suspended by an unseen thread woven into the fabric of space itself. The only sound now was the frantic hammering of his own heart, a drum beat loud enough, he worried, to draw the attention of whatever monstrous thing was silently claiming his airspace. The kerosene pump finally sputtered and died, the sudden loss of the machine's vibration amplifying the night's profound, unnatural stillness. And in that instant, the descent began. Slow, impossibly smooth, and utterly horrifying.
The descent was less a fall and more a deliberate pressing down upon the atmosphere, pushing the silent pressure wave before it. As the immense object dropped lower, its outline began to clarify, not through reflective surfaces, but by sheer mass eclipsing the stars. It wasn't disc-shaped in the classic sense that he might have read about in the occasional supermarket tabloid. It was more like a slightly flattened bell, wider at the base than at the top, perhaps 80 feet across. And then came the sound. It didn't roar like a jet or whine like a helicopter. It vibrated. It was a deep, guttural hum, felt more in the chest cavity and the soles of the feet than heard by the ears. It felt like the resonant frequency of the universe had been hijacked and directed straight at Elias's farmstead. The windows of the old farmhouse, 100 yards away, began to rattle sympathetically, a nervous, delicate chime that was quickly drowned out by the object's growing resonance. The air itself began to feel charged. Elias could smell ozone, that sharp, clean, metallic scent associated with high-voltage electricity or a fresh lightning strike. But there was no storm. He was still holding the pipe wrench, but his arms felt heavy, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and a physiological impact of the vibration. The object settled into a hovering position approximately 50 feet directly over the silo adjacent to his main barn. The sheer scale of it was paralyzing. It was utilitarian, seamless, utterly alien. There were no rivets, no panels, no visible means of propulsion, just this smooth, dark shell that seemed to absorb all light and intention. He tried to shout, to move, to warn Sarah, but his throat seized. The hum was now a living thing inside his head, vibrating his teeth and blurring his vision. Suddenly, small bluish-white sparks began to dance across the metal surfaces nearest the craft. The combine's roof, the galvanized siding of the shed, even the hood of his truck. The static electricity was intense, making the hair on his forearms stand straight up, and the fine dust of the farmyard began to swirl in tiny, rapid vortices directly beneath the massive hall, defying the calm, still air everywhere else. He squinted, trying to discern detail, trying to find a cockpit, a window, anything human or recognizable, but there was nothing. It was a perfect, silent, mechanical predator hanging in the night, and Elias knew with terrifying certainty that it was its sole focus. The realization that this wasn't a military experiment, not a known aircraft, but something profoundly, chillingly other, drained the last of his breath. The vibration reached a painful crescendo, tightening around his skull like a vice, and then from the center of the dark underbelly, something shifted, and a light began to form.
The light was unlike any Elias had ever witnessed. It wasn't yellow or incandescent, or even blue-white like an arc lamp. It was pure, sterile, and terrifyingly intense, focused into a single, massive column that dropped straight down from the center of the craft. It looked less like illumination and more like a solid physical structure made of light itself. When the beam hit the ground, it didn't splash or diffuse. It simply stopped, creating a perfectly defined circle of blinding, clinical brightness that swallowed the colors of the farmyard. Elias was caught on the very edge of the beam, and instantly the physical effects intensified dramatically. The hum vanished, replaced by an unnerving, high-pitched ringing that felt like it was tearing the eardrum. Simultaneously, an intense, draining heat enveloped him, followed immediately by a profound, penetrating coldness that felt like his blood was turning to slush. His muscles locked. This wasn't paralysis caused by fear. This was complete physical immobilization, as if a switch had been thrown, short-circuiting his motor functions. He stood frozen, leaning slightly, his eyes watering from the painful brilliance of the light, the pipe wrench dangling uselessly from his numb fingers. He couldn't even blink. He tried to fight it, mentally urging his legs to move, his jaw to unclench, but his body was no longer answering to him. He was a statue carved in fear, a helpless observer in his own nightmare. The light seemed to penetrate his skin, a feeling of being X-rayed, scrutinized, utterly exposed. In the center of the beam, where the light hit the ground near the silo, the air shimmered, and the dust particles seemed to ascend rapidly into the craft's belly, like filings drawn to a colossal magnet. His focus, forced by the sheer intensity, was drawn to the dark, featureless hull above, and he had the distinct, chilling impression that he was being lowered, slowly, infinitesimally, into the light itself. This sensation of ascent, even as his feet remained firmly planted on the cold earth, was the most disturbing part. His mind began to race, a desperate, silent monologue. No, not this. Please God, not this. He thought of Sarah sleeping soundly inside, shielded by the walls of the old house. He thought of the debt on the farm, the crops awaiting harvest. All the reality he knew was dissolving in this terrifying, brilliant, inescapable column of alien scrutiny. He could feel the pressure building behind his eyes, a strange metallic taste flooding his mouth. He remembered thinking, with a clarity that shocked him, that if he was going to die, he hoped it was quick, because this protracted moment of helplessness was an eternity of pure dread. And then he felt the touch, Not physical contact, but a cold, sterile presence inside his mind, a flood of information that wasn't language, but pure, terrifying intent. He didn't understand what they wanted, only that they were here, and he was absolutely, unconditionally theirs. The transition was instantaneous and brutal. The blinding light snapped off with the finality of a slammed vault door, plunging the world back into relative darkness, broken only by the comforting familiarity of the distant stars. The unbearable cold, the humming pressure, the mental intrusion all ceased in a fraction of a second, leaving a profound vacuum. Elias gasped, the involuntary inhalation burning his dry throat. He stumbled backward, dropping the pipe wrench, which clattered loudly against the frozen earth, the sound echoing harshly in the renewed, yet still unnatural quiet. His muscles were stiff and burning, as if he had run a marathon, and his vision swam violently. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to clear the lingering, ghostly impression of the pure white light. When he lowered his hands, the first thing he noticed wasn't the craft, which was already ascending rapidly and silently back into the upper atmosphere, shrinking instantly into that familiar, terrifying hole in the starfield, but the time. He fumbled for his wrist, looking at the illuminated dial of his old watch. He remembered looking at it when the pump had stopped, 2:38 a.m. Now the small hand pointed definitively past the 5. It was 5:11 a.m. 2 hours and 33 minutes were gone, vanished. He hadn't just stood there for a few agonizing minutes. He had been frozen or occupied or transported for the better part of 3 hours of the cold November night. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a sudden acute psychological panic overriding the initial terror of the craft itself. Where had he been? What had he done? He searched his memory desperately, trying to bridge the gap between the moment the light hit and the moment he gasped and stumbled, but there was nothing. A clean, smooth slate. He ran his hands frantically over his clothes, checking for rips, tears, or residue. His denim jacket was damp with dew, but otherwise intact. His mind, however, felt scorched. He noticed a persistent, dull ache behind his right ear, and when he rubbed the spot, his fingers encountered a small raised welt, hard and tender, that definitely hadn't been there when he'd walked out to the tanks. He looked toward the farmhouse. The dawn was starting to paint the eastern horizon with faint, bruise-colored light. He had to get inside, away from the yawning emptiness of the fields. He scrambled into the cab of the truck, fumbling the key into the ignition. He didn't wait to check the fluid levels or finish his chores. He roared the engine to life, tearing up the frozen dirt path toward the house, the taste of ozone still metallic and sickening on his tongue. Realizing that whatever had happened in those 2.5 missing hours was infinitely more terrifying than the sight of the hovering object itself. He was marked, violated, and incomplete. Elias walked into the kitchen as the clock above the stove chimed 6 times. Sarah was already up, nursing a mug of coffee, preparing to start the breakfast rush. The smell of frying bacon and fresh brewing coffee, usually so comforting, felt jarringly normal, offensively mundane after the night he'd experienced. He leaned against the doorframe, his whole body shaking uncontrollably despite the heated room, the exhaustion of 3 lost hours weighing on him like concrete. Sarah looked up, concerned immediately. He must have looked like a ghost. His face was gray, his eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on something far beyond the kitchen walls. "Elias, what in the world happened to you? You're soaked in dew, and you look like you've seen a ghost." He couldn't lie, not to her. The weight of the secret was already crushing him. He simply sat down heavily at the table, bypassing the coffee, and whispered, his voice dry and scratchy. "I didn't see a ghost, Sarah. I saw a machine. A terrifying machine hanging over the silo. He laid out the story, carefully, painfully, omitting nothing. The silence, the hum, the light, the paralysis, and the terrifying chasm of the missing time. Sarah listened, her initial skepticism slowly dissolving under the sheer conviction and raw terror etched onto her husband's face. She knew Elias. He was practical, stubborn, grounded in the reality of crop cycles and livestock feed. He wasn't prone to flights of fancy. When he finished, she didn't mock him or try to explain it away with weather balloons or secret military tests. She simply reached across the worn formica table and covered his trembling hand with hers. Her support was a fragile lifeline, but it wasn't enough to dispel the gnawing sense of isolation. Elias was tormented by the knowledge that no one outside of that kitchen would ever believe him. How could they? The shame and the secrecy were already beginning to build walls around him. He looked out the window at the familiar geometry of his barn and fields, but they felt utterly foreign now, infected by the memory of the immense, silent presence. He kept touching the small, sore welt behind his ear, convinced that it was a marker, a tracking device, or perhaps just the entry point of a memory he wasn't allowed to access. The world was no longer safe. The sky no longer benign. The profound question that began to settle over him, an inescapable weight, was this: if an event of such magnitude can happen, involving overwhelming power and undeniable physical evidence, which he still had to find, and yet be utterly erased from official record and dismissed as madness by common society, what does that say about the true nature of reality? If we as a civilization are actively choosing to ignore the evidence of such profound visitation, what are we protecting, and what terrifying truths are we willfully sacrificing? I want to ask those of you watching, if you encountered something truly undeniable, something that shattered your understanding of the universe, would you tell anyone, knowing the price of being labeled insane? Or would you bury the truth to preserve the peace? Share your thoughts below, because for Elias, that choice had already been made, and the consequences were just beginning to unfold.
Despite the terror, Elias knew he couldn't hide forever. He had to see the sight in daylight. He needed tangible proof, something solid to anchor his crumbling sanity against the swirling vortex of what if. After Sarah left for her shift at the feed store, Elias drove the truck back out to the area near the silo, his stomach churning with dread. The sunlight felt harsh and judgmental, bleaching the landscape of the mystery it had held hours earlier. At first, the ground looked normal, frozen, dusty earth, tractor tracks pressed into the stubble. But then he reached the spot directly beneath where the main hull had hovered. There, surrounding the base of the silo, was a perfectly circular area, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, where the ground was fundamentally altered. The frozen topsoil had been baked and dried to a fine grayish powder, contrasting sharply with the damp earth outside the perimeter. More chillingly, within that circle, the earth was pressed down in 3 specific points, forming an equilateral triangle of deep conical depressions. Each indentation almost 3 feet across and a foot deep, as if the craft had rested its weight on landing gear designed to compress the very molecules of the soil. He crouched down, running his hand over the strange dust. It felt sterile, inorganic, and faintly warm despite the freezing air. It was definitive, undeniable proof that an immense, heavy object had settled there, radiating intense heat or energy.
He scooped a handful of the strange powder into an old coffee tin he had brought along. He walked further out into the field where the light beam had struck the ground. There were no depressions here, but the winter wheat stubble was not only withered, but curled inward, spiraling tightly toward the center point where the beam had focused its energy, creating a strange miniature crop circle effect spanning about 20 feet. It looked less like damage and more like deliberate pattern imposition. As he was examining the perimeter, a panicked, sustained bleating erupted from the main barn. Elias raced toward the sound. Inside, the cattle were in a state of agitation he'd never seen before. They weren't just restless, they were frantic, eyes rolling white, packed tightly into the far corner of the pen, trying to climb over each other. He spent a grueling hour calming them down, noting that their fear seemed specifically directed at the ceiling, toward the point in the sky where the object had hovered. But the most unsettling discovery came when he found one of his prize breeding bulls, usually a placid, stubborn beast, lying dead in the far stall. There was no visible injury, no struggle, just a profound, sudden stillness. The vet later determined the cause of death was massive heart failure, completely inexplicable for an otherwise healthy animal. The evidence piled up. The missing time, the welt, the baked earth, the strange depressions, the spiraled crops, and the sudden, unexplained death of the bull. This wasn't a nightmare. It was now a physical reality, a scar etched into the very soil he tended. Elias knew then that he couldn't keep this a complete secret. He had the coffee tin full of evidence, and he had to decide who, if anyone, he could trust with this terrifying reality.
Elias tried to maintain a facade of normalcy for a week, planting late-season rye, checking fence lines, trying to re-establish the comforting routine of the farm. But the effort was exhausting. Every shadow held menace. Every passing jet plane sounded like a prelude to the terrible hum, and he jumped at the slightest noise. The coffee tin containing the strange dust was hidden under the loose floorboard in his closet, a talisman of dread. Then, on a Tuesday, while Elias was repairing a section of rusted barbed wire near the south pasture, the black car arrived. It was a large, utterly anonymous sedan, the kind that blends into traffic by being perfectly devoid of character. It pulled right up to the farmhouse, kicking up a plume of dust. Two men emerged. They were both tall, impeccably dressed in dark, generic suits, even though it was mid-afternoon in rural Kansas. They wore sunglasses that mirrored the pale sky, completely obscuring their eyes and any hint of emotion. Their haircuts were precise, short, and dated, looking almost molded. They moved with an unsettling efficiency that suggested total control over their surroundings. Elias dropped his tools and walked slowly toward them, his heart pounding a desperate rhythm against his ribs. These men were the embodiment of the secretive dread he had felt since the night of the encounter. They didn't introduce themselves. The taller of the two, whose face was unnervingly pale and smooth, simply said in a flat, monotone voice that held no regional accent, "Mr. Thorne, we understand you experienced a localized atmospheric disturbance last Tuesday morning, a misidentified meteorological anomaly." Elias felt a sudden surge of cold defiance mixed with fear. He crossed his arms. "I saw what I saw. It wasn't weather." The second man, shorter and stockier, stepped slightly forward, his hands clasped neatly in front of him. "We understand that these events can be psychologically taxing. Memory can be unreliable, especially in the dark. We need to impress upon you, Mr. Thorne, the importance of maintaining silence regarding the, shall we say, misinterpretation of this event." They never raised their voices,
never made an overt threat, but the sheer weight of their controlled presence was more terrifying than any shouting. They knew exactly when and where the incident occurred. They knew about his isolation. They weren't asking, they were informing him of his new reality. They spent the next hour inside, ostensibly examining the site near the silo. Elias watched, impotent, as they systematically collected soil and residue samples, producing small, sterile tools from a hidden compartment in their sedan. When they returned, the tall man held a small plastic evidence bag containing some of the strangely burnt stubble. "This data is classified, Mr. Thorne. Any attempt to disseminate details about this unauthorized air movement, even locally, will be viewed as a threat to national security." The implication hung heavy. They wouldn't just discredit him, they would destroy him. They hadn't touched the coffee tin in his closet, but the threat was clear. They could know anything, anytime. As they drove away, leaving nothing but dust and a profound sense of violation behind, Elias realized the secret wasn't just his to carry anymore. The government, or whatever shadowy agency these men represented, owned his experience, and his nightmare was now part of America's hidden history.
The official visit cemented Elias's isolation. He couldn't trust his neighbors. If those men in black suits could materialize instantly on a remote farm, they were certainly watching every phone line and conversation. He grew guarded, withdrawn, speaking only in clipped sentences, focusing obsessively on his work to avoid the swirling emptiness in his mind. But avoidance was impossible. The psychological damage inflicted by those missing hours and the silent, cold intrusion was a constant companion. He began suffering from vivid, recurring night terrors. They weren't always coherent, but they shared common, terrifying themes. The smell of clinical sterility, high-pitched, insistent tones that felt like data being forced into his consciousness, and the sensation of floating weightlessly under immense, convex white lights. He would wake up slick with sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, sometimes finding himself standing in the center of the bedroom, disoriented and shouting soundlessly. Sarah tried to help, soothing him, bringing him tea, but she couldn't enter the sterile, fear-infused landscape of his memories. He started noticing peculiar physical symptoms beyond the welt behind his ear. There was a chronic low-level ringing in his left ear that never faded, a phantom echo of the craft's oppressive hum. He developed a sudden, acute sensitivity to bright lights, having to wear dark sunglasses even on overcast days. Furthermore, there were moments of profound disorientation throughout the day. Standing in the field, looking out over the familiar rows of earth, he would suddenly feel intensely disconnected, as if the reality he inhabited was flimsy, a thin veneer stretched over something cold and alien. The world felt muted, dull, lacking the vibrancy it had possessed before that November night. He started drawing obsessively in a small, worn notebook, sketching the object again and again, the massive, flattened bell shape, the seamless hull, the impossible darkness it radiated. He never showed anyone the sketches, but the act of trying to capture the form helped anchor his memory. He became obsessed with the possibility of retrieval. What if he hadn't lost those hours? What if the memory was just suppressed, waiting to claw its way back? He began reading every book he could find on hypnosis and repressed trauma, desperate to unlock the vault. But the truth was, his fear wasn't just about the lost time. It was about the confirmation that they were still out there. The men in black suits hadn't been worried about a weather balloon. They were worried about the truth, and their vigilance proved that the visitors hadn't simply left Earth. They had simply moved on to the next isolated witness, leaving Elias as a broken, traumatized sentinel guarding a secret too vast and terrifying for the world to comprehend. The farm, his life's work, felt like a cage, and the quiet Kansas sky, once a source of comfort, was now just a vast, cold expanse from which unimaginable horrors could descend at any moment. The paranoia became a self-fulfilling prophecy, driving a wedge between Elias and the community he had always been a part of. The neighbors noticed his withdrawal, the way his hands shook when he held a cup of coffee, the dark circles under his eyes. Whispers started circulating in town. Elias Thorne was finally cracking under the pressure of farming debt, or perhaps he was drinking heavily. He couldn't refute the rumors without confirming the absolute truth, which was forbidden. The isolation was agonizing, particularly during the long, frigid winter months of 1980. He felt like an actor in a play, mimicking the life of a farmer, while his true self was trapped somewhere in the cold light of that hovering machine. His relationships suffered. Sarah was patient, resilient, but even her strength wavered under the constant tension of living with a man who was psychologically tormented and perpetually looking over his shoulder. He never told her about the sketches or the persistent ringing in his ear, protecting her from the deeper elements of his trauma. Spring came, bringing the endless labor of plowing and planting, but the fields offered no solace. Every time he worked near the silo, he could still feel the residual energy, the invisible scar in the ground. He frequently checked the pressure points left by the landing gear. They remained stubbornly intact, defying the natural settling of the soil. He realized that the trauma had fundamentally changed his relationship with technology. He refused to buy a television, fearing subtle signals or hypnotic patterns. He would disconnect the phone line at night, convinced they could use it to listen, or worse, to communicate directly with him again. He was living in a state of primitive technological rejection, finding peace only in the simple, manual labor of the fields, away from the complex electric grid that felt potentially hostile. The true haunting wasn't the memory of the craft, which was distinct and clear. It was the persistent, cold curiosity about the missing hours. He constantly revisited the feeling of the mental intrusion, a sense of vast, cold intellect observing him, categorizing him, stripping him down to his essence. It hadn't felt malicious, just utterly indifferent, like a scientist dissecting an insect. This indifference was arguably more frightening than outright hostility, because it implied a hierarchical gulf so vast that human life was merely data, easily acquired and easily discarded. He often spent hours staring at the night sky, his breath fogging the window pane, searching not for another sighting, but for confirmation that the universe was still ordered, still rational. But the silence, that profound, crushing silence that had heralded the graft's arrival, had poisoned the night forever, turning the dark expanse into a constant, looming threat.
Years blurred into a slow, tense procession. Elias survived the 1980s, the farm just barely making it through the harsh economic climate, held together by Sarah's steadfast budgeting and his own grueling, relentless labor. The trauma faded into a dull, constant ache, but the fundamental fear remained, a deep, cellular knowledge that his reality was a lie. He never spoke publicly about the incident again, adhering strictly to the silent threat delivered by the men in black. He became a case study in enforced silence, a living witness to a suppressed event. By 1989, the depression marks near the silo were finally beginning to soften, covered by the growth of tenacious weeds, but to Elias, they were as fresh as the day they were made. His children grew up knowing their father was different, a quiet, intense man who preferred the isolation of his fields to the company of neighbors, a man who never looked up at a night sky without a twitch of anxiety crossing his face. They attributed it to the hard life of farming, never knowing the true, cold secret he carried. Then came the anniversary, 10 years to the day, November 14th, 1989. It was a clear, bitterly cold night, mirroring the conditions of that terrifying night a decade prior. Elias was older now, heavier, his hair threaded with gray, but his vigilance had never wavered. He was checking the barn one last time before heading to bed, a habit born of the 1979 incident, when the silence returned. It wasn't as sudden or localized as before. This time it was a subtle, gradual draining of ambient sound. He noticed the generator he kept running for the water heater suddenly sounding muted, distant, as if the sound waves were being absorbed before they reached him. He stopped dead, dropping the lantern he carried, his blood turning instantly to ice. This wasn't imagination. This was the prelude. He slowly walked out into the open yard, his eyes scanning the star-dusted horizon. He didn't look up immediately. He looked far out, toward the eastern plain, toward the boundary line of his land. And there it was. Not directly overhead this time, not claiming his farm, but moving with the same impossible silent grace high over the next county. A light, far brighter and more complex than any conventional aircraft, pulsating with a subtle internal light that seemed to shift colors from deep orange to a cold, faint blue. It wasn't the same shape. This was a triangular configuration, sharp-edged and enormous, moving too slow for a meteor, too silent for a plane. It was following a perfectly straight trajectory that defied wind or resistance, etching a line of cold terror across the night. It moved with the unmistakable authoritative signature of alien technology, that profound lack of visible effort, that silent, overwhelming power. It was a confirmation that the 1979 event hadn't been a stray occurrence, but part of a sustained, decades-long visitation. They hadn't gone away. They had simply expanded their range, perhaps learned to be even quieter, even more elusive. Elias stood there, rooted to the spot, watching the triangular shape glide out of view beyond the distant tree line. He didn't feel panic this time, only a deep, profound resignation. He was not mad. He was simply one of millions living under a veil of manufactured ignorance, and the visitors were still conducting their cold, silent survey of the human condition, making their subtle intrusions into the private lives of farmers, forgotten and dismissed by the history books. His nightmare was real, and it was still flying high above the Kansas plains, utterly untouchable and constantly observing. The silence lingered long after the light disappeared, a chilling reminder of his perpetual vulnerability and the vast, unknown cosmos pressing in on the margins of his quiet life.